Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. I'm Murray Rundus, the production manager and editor here at Catholic Family News. I'm very happy to be joined by Anthony Stine. Many of our audience knows who Anthony Stine is. He hosts the Return to Tradition, great show over there, along with being a regular contributor to Catholic Family News. Anthony, how have you been?
Other than this cold I warned you about ahead of time, doing pretty well.
Well, that's great. Well, Anthony, I wanted to first talk about your show in general, because I think many people appreciate how frequent it is and how thorough it usually is, but it started over 5 years ago. And so I wanted to ask you that, that's a much different landscape in the traditional Catholic world than it is now. What inspired you to start Return to Tradition and start that work?
Several years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, I'd noticed that there was no Catholic commentary really in the format that I was seeing on the most independent kind of media. There were a lot of like disaffected liberals even 10 years ago who were doing secular commentary, and they were trying to make sense of what was going on in the world because they were liberals, classical liberals, some of them kind of progressive, but they were noticing this sort of unhuman rise of like strident atheistic feminism. And many of these guys were atheists, but they had a format that I thought was interesting. And I was like, somebody should apply that to the, church commentary. And at the time, the only one doing anything similar to that was Church Militant. But even then, Church Militant commentary was very more structured than what I was seeing. But I had this feeling I should start a YouTube channel, but I sort of ignored it for a few years until one day I had, after moving to Oklahoma to take a job at a Catholic university that closed 8 months after I got here. We did the background. We did the due diligence, by the way, and to see how their finances were, and that data was out of date. Mm-hmm. But then I took another job at a secular university, and the people who interviewed me for that job were all gone by the time I relocated to Tulsa to go work there. Yeah. And the people who were supposed to train me for this job, for a very complicated kind of job that I was capable of doing if I'd been trained, weren't there anymore. I didn't even have a supervisor. My supervisor at the time was the actual department head, who was like 3 levels above where we were. So I didn't last very long there. And while I was looking for a job, I decided to just make YouTube videos, because you can only apply for so many jobs a day. That really, especially in this day and age where job application websites are often just autofill kind of things, and then you just fill in a few other things. You can only do so much of that a day. So I started a YouTube channel, and 3 months after I started it, despite the fact that everything was in mono and everything was just, I didn't know what I was doing on a technical side, Archbishop Vigano released his famous letter, his first letter. And I put it up because I noticed no one else had. And I just walked away from YouTube that day and then came back the next day, and my channel size had doubled. And so after that, it was just kind of became daily after that. And but the landscape has changed. I noticed one of the things I find fascinating is, it used to be that if I put something up from Archbishop Lefebvre, one of his famous sermons or statements, or said anything even remotely friendly to the Society of St. Pius X, I would lose subscribers. That's not the case anymore. As some have quipped, Pope Francis has been the best recruiter for the SSPX. He's absolutely been their best recruiter.
Yeah, it's very strange, and it's very interesting to see how that has, because I remember the same thing, how just mentioning Archbishop Lefebvre could immediately cause people to shriek in fear. I wanted to talk about one of the things I think is so striking about your channel is its logo with Hilaire Bellock with the sunglasses. You said elsewhere that Bellock and Chesterton were big influences on you converting to Catholicism, for going from agnosticism. And I wanted to ask, what impact did Bellock and Chesterton have on you? Why did you find them such striking figures? And how do you think that they could help people today, despite being writers from so long ago?
They didn't help me with my conversion. It was actually some friends of mine I had who were stood out because even though they do not agree with me on anything today. These are very Pope Francis is the greatest thing ever kind of Catholics, but they still were something different about the way they were living. Right. And that's what attracted me. But when I was, I'd been Catholic a few years, and Pope Francis put out Laudato Si. And I was like interested in Catholic social teaching. And it was months before it was being released. People kept saying, "Oh, Pope Francis is going to update Catholic social teaching, add something to this body of work. And I being a political scientist, I'm like, Catholic social teaching, what's this? This sounds cool. So I went online, started doing some research. And if you start doing any research, even superficially, you're going to stumble across G.K. Chesterton and distributism. Do I call myself a distributist? I mean, in theory, sure, but you can't be a distributist in the modern world and actually function. It's just not possible, right? Like, unless you're literally buying all your groceries at the local farmer's market and you're buying everything from like decentralized people in the economy, it's impossible. But philosophically, sure, I try to shop locally when I can. I think local politics are usually more important than national politics. Not always the case, but I started watching Dale Elquist's lectures online, which then got me to pick up some Chesterton, which led to Bellock. And, years before I was a Catholic, I'd been a sort of a center left Democrat, right? Pro-gun, like sportsman, outdoor stuff. Dodged the abortion question, actively dodged it, refused to think about it, because when people ask why are so many people how can they get along with abortion? It's simple. They're avoiding thinking about it, actively avoiding thinking about it. That's, I can tell you from experience. But Chesterton and Bellock were writing towards anarchists and socialists and trying to show them the Catholic Church's solution to the social questions of the day were actually the way to do things. And it did help reconcile some things for me in terms of my own political leanings, which is funny because now I'm far more conservative than I would have ever thought I'd ever be in life. But, that's such as how it goes. But I still love Bellock and Chesterton to this day. I found an article of his that could be used as a defense of trolling that I put up on my channel. I don't remember what it's called. Let me see if I could find it. So I just said something very, very provocative, right?
Right.
Well, one of them is like, one of them that I put up in October of 2022, how to become famous and narcissistic. I don't remember what the actual title of it, the title of the piece is, but that's what I call the video, right? That's just one. But he has so many of these that where he kind of just does a defense of mocking things. And a lot of people don't understand it, but if you actually read scripture, there are times where it's pretty clear Jesus is using very biting language to describe the people he's against, that he's trying to correct, trying to reach. And I think there's a place for that, right ordered place for it. As somebody who, for example, carries a lot of extra body weight than I should, I do think there's a place for fat shaming, depending who's doing it and what their purpose is and how they do it. We've all heard stories of the guy who kind of lovingly bullied his friend into losing weight and then helped save his life. That's a good example. But going around and, fat shaming total strangers is probably not the most productive or Christian thing you could be doing. Give you an idea. But I like Bellock and Chesterton because they used humor and rhetoric in a very, very effective way to get their point across. And they get demonized today for a lot of it. Their writings are purposely misrepresented today. It's why I kind of chuckled when I saw there was a cause for the canonization of G.K. Chesterton. I was like, well, good luck. And because one, he was a glutton. So good luck on that count. But two, the things he wrote were so spicy, you can't talk about them on YouTube and some things. And
No, certainly. And
yeah,
I think one of the most fascinating things about them, in a way, even though they were much more sophisticated, I think, than the average YouTube commentator, I think they would appreciate this space that has been created. I think that's what their core was, is sort of speaking in that common rhetorical language, even though if it was elevated back then. And I think you would appreciate this space a lot. You mentioned you were you are a political scientist. I did want to get briefly your take on this election, and particularly on one thing, which is you hear many people, and this happens every election, saying this is the most important election to happen in our lifetimes. And I wanted to get your take on that. Do you think Catholics should pay much attention to the political world, or do you think we should focus on other things instead? Are other things more important than focusing on politics?
it's funny you mentioned that. I this morning recorded for this weekend for my channel pastoral sermon of Monsignor Ronald Knox. I like to find these old books that are definitely open copyright because of how old they are by these great figures. and find some of their sermons. And Monsignor Knox is talking about the actual homily I'll be giving that I've recorded for this coming Sunday is called "The Responsibilities of Man," and it's mostly about needing to keep your eyes on the cross and all that. But he says explicitly, it is right ordered that people pay attention to politics and be involved in the political processes. His admonition is don't replace God with that. That's the thing you have to worry about. So I always find it funny where like political idolatry is a very real thing. Trump's an easy example to use for that, but I saw people do it to Obama. Okay, I did. People kind of there's an attempt to try to turn our politicians into messianic figures, and they are like the false gods of false gods if you're going to do that.
Mhm.
However, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't support people who are going to do the least damage that they can. Father Ripperger recently talked about how the lesser of two voting for the lesser of two evils is legitimate, because you're not voting for the evil that they do. You're voting against the evil that the other person is going to do, and for the good that the lesser of two evils can do. I know a lot of people don't like to hear that, especially with some of the stuff Trump has said about abortion recently, but the other person wants to bring in Roe v. Wade back, whatever that means, because say what you want about that decision. It didn't allow for late-term abortion like they tried to push in Virginia, right? It didn't. But that's what they want. So, I mean, they made my choice easy, even if, I've got some serious social issue questions with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. But do we have a responsibility? Sure. Keep your eyes on the cross, though. Stay close to faith. Go to mass every day. Probably not a good idea to skip mass, go to a political rally, right? Things like that. Make a little extra time if you find this stuff stressful for listening to a good homily online or reading scripture. Remember, folks, if you're in a state of grace, you get an indulgence for spending 15 minutes with scripture. That's not much. That is not much. And I believe the church has said, yes, in the modern age, that could be listening to it on Audible. Okay. I mean,
easier than ever.
Not hard, but we all are awful at this. So make the provisions to keep yourself grounded a little bit.
Yeah. I share the same concerns with some of the things in the Trump campaign and with his vice presidential pick, but I think you're right. I think there is a big difference between what the GOP is promoting and then what we saw at the DNC. Moving to the church a tad, I wanted to ask about your latest article you wrote for Catholic Family News, which is talking about this Dominican group of sisters that is recently being forced to celebrate the Novus Ordo or attend the Novus Ordo under certain circumstances. And I think many people are wondering, we don't know how long this pontificate is going, but if it does last another 2 or 3 years, where do you think the Latin Mass will be? And further, have you come to the conclusion that some of these former Ecclesia Dei groups have an intrinsic problem, an intrinsic compromise that will lead to a loss of the Latin Mass in those communities in the future? And what can be done in these communities to preserve the Latin Mass, even if we are stuck with this pontificate for years to come?
I tend to think that Francis will be around longer than most people think, but at the same time, there are clear and obvious signs that those closest to him think there's a conclave coming. You see this with Pietro Parolin, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Secretary of State for the Vatican, actively campaigning to be Pope right now. You see it with Cardinal Zuppi, who is also of the Bergoglian Francis side of things, actively campaigning to be Pope. He's the peace envoy to Ukraine and is seen as often as he can be getting photographed with kids and doing a lot of the glad handing, who also, by the way, just authorized Father Marco Rupnik to continue his murals in the cathedral in his diocese. So, yeah. And I'm working on a video for later in the week about why that is. And it's the hint is it's politics. It's the reason he's doing it, probably. So will we have him for longer than we think? Probably. But those closest to him are giving you the early warning signs. Do I think the FSSP are compromised? I go to mass with the FSSP. I'm very pro SSPX, very pro Lefebvre. I'm also very pro FSSP. I understand why their founders couldn't go along with the consecrations. I tend to think Lefebvre was in the right, but that doesn't mean I don't understand where the FSSP came from. tend to think it's a behind the scenes, bishops need to work all this stuff out kind of question. But are they compromised? I don't want to say yes, because the FSSP heads in the past have said explicitly that they are not a traditional organization, traditional priestly fraternity. They're just dedicated to the preconciliar mass and sacraments, which is different. But so are they compromised? I don't know, because I've also spoken with many priests off the record from the FSSP who will never say the new mass. I just wonder how far they will let it be pushed for the transformations of the traditional liturgy. And because what those nuns are dealing with, religious orders tend to be, I think, the testing ground for what they want to do to the rest of the church, because they're out of sight. Unless they say something, nobody's going to find out what's going on. And so those nuns were told their daily mass has to be replaced with the Novus Ordo daily mass, that their Latin mass offerings on the weekends have to be said in accordance with the Mass of Paul VI's liturgical calendar. I don't know how you do that, by the way. If you're a Latin Mass Catholic, this is not just the Mass said in Latin. It is an entirely different liturgy. It has its own calendar, and the settings in the Mass are for the old calendar. So I don't know how you do that. It will take their priest will have to be liturgically minded in ways that very few seem to be, to really be able to translate one to the other. But that's kind of the point, isn't it? It's to make them a deal they can't refuse, an offer they can't refuse. They have to take it to show that they are loyal. And that group of nuns on their website explicitly talks about their loyalty to Rome. Because unfortunately, in the current ecclesiastical landscape, a lot of religious orders who are dedicated to the preconciliar forms of things have to explicitly say they are traditional, because they're afraid to go independent. Maybe there's legit logistics reasons. Maybe I don't know. There's a lot of reasons. I try not to second guess religious on this stuff, but women religious especially seem to be the ones who get prone to this of getting crushed, because after the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate, they did fight back, and it caused a headache right out of the gates for Pope Francis. So it seems like mostly it's been women religious. Maybe that's to do with temperament of men versus women, but even then, many of the women religious have resisted too and caused headaches. Take a look at what's going down in Arlington, Texas. Or there's a new religious community of women religious popping up in Florida now that are semi-independent, relying on the SSPX for sacraments. I mean, you see this stuff, and I think we've maybe hit a breaking point on it.
Yeah. And, we're in a very dynamic space when it comes to the church, and things are changing quite a bit. There's a lot of new factors being introduced even in the past year. We've talked about the former Ecclesia Dei communities, the SSPX, but something that I find very interesting is this sort of new wave of traditionalism. And I think you can point to somebody like Bishop Strickland or Archbishop Vigano, who have faced persecution from Pope Francis and have ideas of their own, and they're sort of developing on their own. And I wanted to ask, do you think traditional Catholics should look to those men as shepherds for the movement? If we want to call it a movement, should we look to them as shepherds, or should we look to these more traditional groups and give our attention more to them than these newcomer archbishops?
I mean, you should go to Mass every Sunday.
Right.
So Bishop Strickland is probably not going to be able to help you much with that. And Archbishop Vigano has founded a priestly fraternity. I think it's a priestly fraternity called Exsurge Domine. They train priests and things, but I think the priests are just mostly independent. So your mileage may vary if you're going to be relying on them for your sacraments. This is why I think it behooves everybody to first and foremost know the faith. Know the faith, even if you're attending the new Mass. That way, if the priest starts saying some really weird stuff, you should know the faith enough to know whether or not you need to leave that parish. I will never tell anybody that you must get out of the Novus Ordo. You are a false Catholic if you are in the Novus Ordo. I will never be that guy. Never be that person. Some of the best priests and deacons I've ever met were ordinary form priests and deacons. They absolutely were. I've also encountered the 1970s era, 1960s era priest who tells you, certain sins aren't that big a deal. Go receive confession, or go receive the communion. Just say an act of contrition before you go up. Yeah, okay. Right. I've experienced both sides of that coin. But I do also suggest everybody find their nearest traditional mass. Stop paying attention to anti-SSPX propaganda. Also view with suspicion anybody who generally tells you that the FSSP or the Institute of Christ the King are not real priests or whatever. Yeah, I know the SSPX and the FSSP, their leadership does not like each other, and they say some pretty have hot takes about each other. Again, I'd like that stuff to be handled behind the scenes, but you can get the valid sacraments from them. Novus Ordo is still valid, so, but I do suggest people find that. But when it comes to like teaching, obviously listen to your bishop, but know the faith. But I don't think there's a problem with paying attention to Bishop Strickland and learning from him, or even Archbishop Vigano. I don't agree with Archbishop Vigano on geopolitics, on a lot of what he said about that, Putin and Russia and stuff. But you do get much more sound Orthodox things from them, especially in the crisis in the church, than you do from most any bishop who has regular jurisdiction, because most of them live under fear of being canceled. I have that under good authority, that there are far more who are at least traditionally minded, at least to a degree, than we think in the United States and in Europe. It's just that they've seen what happened to the bishop in Puerto Rico who spoke out, to Bishop Strickland, and to the bishop in France. I can never pronounce the name of that diocese, but the one that couldn't have ordinations for 2 years because they had this bad habit of ordaining men who wanted to be traditional priests. They've seen what's happening, and so they keep their powder dry. They keep their mouth shut. But you'll notice most of them don't teach heterodox things.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to ask as well, when it comes to the future of the traditional movement, and in two ways, how do you think that the traditional movement can expand in terms of expanding traditional chapels, getting different places traditional chapels when the Latin Mass is in the state that it is with Traditionis Custodes, but further, what can we do as just traditional Catholic faithful to help expand the traditional movement around us, to help people see the glory of the Latin Mass? Do you see there as being any cultural things that we can work on within this traditional Catholic community that might accelerate the rate in which we expand? In those two ways, how do you think the traditional Catholic movement can expand?
If you have Catholic friends, invite them to your traditional parish, even if that means they carpool with you, because a roadblock I've encountered many times is, I don't have a traditional Mass within 20-minute drive of me. My family, 4 kids in the car, drive 90 miles, so it's not 20 minutes for us. Invite your friends, especially if they start complaining about their parishes. Father Old Hippie started talking about, why we need to, he didn't endorse Kamala Harris at the altar, but he practically did, or in a disordered version from the other side. His whole homily was about how great Trump is. That's not where I want to hear that stuff at Mass. Well, invite them to Mass with you. Even if you have to give them a ride, that's part of it. On a personal level, read old books. I mean, if it's a good rule of thumb, seems to be published from before the 1950s, you'll probably be okay. But read old Catholic books, learn the faith yourself, and if you have the means to do it, there's nothing wrong with having an altar in the home. You can have a home altar for a setting for a Mass to be said. Plenty of laity do. That doesn't mean you need to have the sacrament reserved yourself there. And just start making the connections in your parish, because somebody in a traditional parish probably knows of an independent priest or knows of the SSPX. Because, for instance, the SSPX in Oklahoma City, the priest shows up on Sunday, coming in from probably St. Mary's, says the Mass, then within 30 minutes of Mass being over, he's gone, hopping into a truck to go say Mass at someone's farmhouse or something. There's a lot of these Masses being offered out there. Keep your ear to the ground on that. And when it comes to independent priests, you want to vet them. You want to find out who they are, because there have been plenty of priests canceled for very good reasons. Okay, I don't think I need to explain to you the good reasons some get canceled, but all too many have been canceled because they were like Father Kalchik up in Chicago, who found a bunch of James Martin type stuff up in his parish attic and allowed the parishioners to burn them. And then he got canceled for it by Cardinal Supich, if you remember that story. And all too many priests like that. So do some vetting. You want to make sure you're not getting a con artist or you're not getting a predator that you're allowing to say a mass in your home or something. You have to do your due diligence. And if that sounds kind of depressing to hear, remember the words Sister Lucia used to describe the state of the church. She said, "The diabolic disorientation had entered the church." This is absolutely accurate, 100% accurate. That's why so many good Catholics will see their lukewarm priest at Mass in a typical parish who engages in liturgical errors and sometimes talks about how, yeah, we need women priests and things. And they think, this is fine. This is not that big of a deal. Right? That's why things are the way they are. It's because to a certain degree, everybody, their perception of the state of the church has been influenced by the diabolic disorientation. And that's why your surest sign for navigating it is to just figure out what the church always taught about things from before the 50s. Mm-hmm. That way, because those books are out there. You can find them for cheap. A lot of them are still getting reprinted. Mediatrix Press prints old Catholic books. They're not the only ones. You can find old Catholic books, stay close to the sacraments. And if you are not sold on moving completely to the traditional Mass, at least go there once or twice on a Sunday. Maybe take Taylor Marshall's 6-week challenge. Give it a shot at least know where it is, and get out of the mindset that 20 minutes is too far away. I wish my parish was only 20 minutes away. I'd save so much money on gas. It'd be ridiculous.
Yeah, we're living in a time where, as I mentioned, things are changing quite a bit for traditionalists, and things are still somewhat difficult when it comes to material means. Many people are away from a Latin Mass, but do you see it as we're going to see more independent priests as time goes on? If we don't see Traditionis Custodes revoked, do you think we're going to see more of these sort of hidden secret masses from diocesan priests saying the Latin Mass in the shadows? What do you think of those? Should that be the way a lot of these priests go, or do you think that they should go to more typical options like the FSSP, SSPX for those priests in general? Where do you see the traditional movement going?
I think you're going to see more priests joining up with Exsurge Domine. As an example, they operate in the United States now. As long as Archbishop Vigano is around, which man is like 82 or 83 years old, so who knows how long that'll be. And I'm not trying to be morbid. We're just being realistic. I hope he's got a succession plan already in place. As long as that happens, you're going to see that the traditional, little t traditional priestly fraternities, they're very discerning on who they allow in for good reason. You want them to be discerning. But when you look at their ordinations, they're all either record or near record ordinations. Their seminary classes are huge, relatively speaking. The FSSP in North America's seminary class looks larger than most dioceses, which on the one hand sounds great until you realize, well, they got to then spread all those priests all across North America, which yeah. So, but then again, a certain reading of Traditionis Custodes means you can't even build a new FSSP chapel in your diocese either, depending how you read it. So at some point they're going to hit a ceiling, unless they take a page from the SSPX and start actively having their priests drive around to offer masses. But then you start running into other problems with Traditionis Custodes.
Right.
So I do think that most priests should carefully discern what it is their options are and what to do. And going independent is a very heavy cross for a priest to take. Absolute independence, meaning they don't have a bishop, giving them permission off the sacraments. I mean, that's not exactly a small deal. That is a very serious decision they have to make for themselves. But I totally understand why some priests will legitimately come to that decision. Like a year ago, when the Coalition for Canceled Priests and Father Altman were kind of fighting amongst themselves, I really hated reporting on that stuff because those priests had all been canceled illegitimately, in my book, and they're all decent priests. And I can understand why some of them who'd been canceled won't offer the sacraments because they don't have permission from a bishop. But I also understand the flip side of that too, because what is the first law of the church? The first law of the church is the salvation of souls. And every other law is secondary to that, including obedience to your bishop. It does tell you how bad the state of things is when you can say there are legitimate times where a priest has to ignore his bishop or his permissions. Hence why if a priest in a diocese has one of the hardline bishops who says no at all to any traditional Latin Mass, or maybe they have an FSSP parish on the edge of their diocese because there's an SSPX chapel there, and that priest decides he needs to offer a traditional Mass periodically underground without the permission of the bishop, I can see why he would legitimately come to that decision, especially if you've got like a McElroy or somebody like that as your ordinary.
Yeah, it's very difficult for these priests, and we should be praying for them constantly. And that's not a cliche. I think they're definitely experiencing spiritual warfare that they're going to have to go through, and we can help them out. So, sort of to wrap things up, Anthony, you've been in this commentary world for a long time. You've seen all of these events unfold. The past 5 years have been crazy when it comes to a lot of this stuff developing. And you've also had your own journey coming from agnosticism. What advice would you give somebody who might be new to this whole world, who comes in, is sort of overwhelmed and doesn't know what to make to make of everything going on around him? What advice would you give to him to stay sane and to maybe not make the same mistakes that you see other new to tradition people face?
Remember, of course, the cliche. It's a cliched statement because we all make it that, our Lord promised us we'll win in the end, right?
Yeah.
But spend as much time learning the faith as you do listening to church politics. So it's sort of the same advice I give about people paying attention to secular politics. Learn the faith, get strong in your faith. And whenever I live stream, I'm always ending it with say, pray for the people we talked about today, because we're not here to stir up negative feelings in your heart towards these people. We should never be doing that. You're supposed to pray for them. Jesus tells us to pray even for our enemies. That kind of tells me we're supposed to pray for everybody, which is a physical impossibility. We don't have that much time, in our lives. But pray for those who are trying to undermine the church, trying to impose this new religion on the church or whatever. Because at the end of the day, if you stay close to the sacraments, you pray a rosary, you go to Mass, and you read edifying books, then you'll probably be all right. And periodically, if you need to take a break from paying attention, people do take a week off here or there. That's totally fine. I do caution people because I always find it funny when people take Lent off from listening to this stuff, because it always seems like the most interesting stuff that needs your prayer attention the most happens during Lent. I shudder every time Lent rolls around because I pay attention to what goes on in Germany and Austria, because without fail, some bishop there decides to put some horrifyingly blasphemous art in their chapel for Lent every year without fail. And those figures need your prayers. It's what it's for.
Yeah.
So stay rooted in prayer, learn the faith, and you should be okay. I would caution people, if you're new to the faith, from trying to jump into commentary and things yourself. You sometimes see that happen, and then it doesn't usually go well for the people doing it. The internet can be ruthless, especially on Twitter. Anonymity allows people to be utterly ruthless online.
Yeah. As much as I love Twitter, it is a brutal place often.
Especially since it's now freer speech under Elon Musk. It's gotten much more brutal.
Yes, and the free speech, it's good in some respects, but goodness, you are right. Well, Anthony, where can people find your material outside of course, reading your articles in Catholic Family News?
I'm on YouTube or Spotify or any podcasting places. Return to Tradition on screen. You can see where you find me if you're on X, formerly Twitter. You can find me there. But yeah, those are the main places. If you find me on Facebook, you could add me. I might add you back, but you might be subjected to silly memes all day, because that's what I use my Facebook for.
Well, great. We'll have a link to that stuff in the description below. And of course, you can check out Anthony's articles, which are often amazing in our paper. They're a highlight of our paper at CatholicFamilyNews.com. You can go over there and subscribe. So to our audience, thanks for watching. And Anthony, thanks for joining.
Thank you.